get started. So today I'm pleased to be your moderator and one of the presenters for our webinar on sun exposure and outdoor workers. My name is Cheryl Peters. I'm a research scientist at the Cancer Epidemiology and Prevention Research Department at Alberta Health Services, as well as an adjunct professor at the University of Calgary, and I'm the co-principal investigator of CAREX Canada. So you'll see all of our logos up there. This project isn't directly a CAREX project, but because a lot of the precursor work to everything we've kind of done in sun safety really led into this project, and because CAREX is going to sort of house a lot of the information that we'll have about the project, which we will share with you later, you'll sort of see a lot of CAREX information being shared. So we're going to have a presentation of about 40 to 45 minutes. We'll leave time for questions in the chat box. I'm also pleased to welcome our second speaker for the day, who is Ms. Nicole Sloth. She's a research associate here at Cancer Epidemiology and Prevention Research. She's going to present on the monitoring and surveillance portion of the webinar today, as she led most of the data collection for that piece. And also our other research associate, Sajjad Fazal, is in the background here monitoring the Zoom meeting and helping out in the background. So welcome to Sajjad as well. Before getting started, I'd like to take a moment to make a few acknowledgements. First of all, our funding source for this project is Alberta Labour and Immigration's OHS Futures Grant Program, and we wouldn't have been able to do this really exciting work without their support, so thanks for that. We also have a number of co-investigators who helped us in the grant preparation, as well as a number of collaborators who either worked directly on the study or provided us guidance in recruiting people to be in the study and other various knowledge translation activities. And also, of course, participants in the studies. We really thank the people who were in the monitoring part of the study, as well as the people who participated in the interviews for our surveillance part. So we've split the webinar today into 3 pieces. I'm going to cover parts 1 and 2. And then I'll turn it over to Nicole for part 3. And then finally, I'll come back and make a few summary points before we open it up for questions and comments. So I'm going to talk first about some of the importance of why we care about UV radiation in outdoor workers, and give you a few stats and facts to convince you of the same. And then I will talk to you a little bit about a monitoring campaign for UV radiation exposure in outdoor workers, and then I'll pass it to Nicole to talk about some of the barriers and facilitators of surveillance systems for outdoor workers. So let's get started on the importance and challenges of solar radiation as an occupational hazard. So what is this issue? So skin cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer in Canada. You can see there, I have a pie. This data is a little bit old. It's just because our data on skin cancer is a little bit delayed. So I still use this 2015 data. But it basically shows you that in Canada yearly, about 1/3 of all cancer diagnoses are skin cancer, which sometimes shocks some people. It's quite a big one. Most of these are non-melanoma skin cancers. And so some of you might be familiar with these. They're not fatal. They tend to be treated within a dermatologist's office, so they're not as serious as some of the other cancers, but they certainly cause a great deal of burden to workers as well as to anyone who gets a non-melanoma skin cancer. The other thing that's interesting about solar radiation is that it's largely preventable. And despite this, actually, the incidence continues to increase. So most cancers in Canada are on the decline in terms of incidence because we've done a lot of great prevention work for things like lung cancer. But skin cancer is one of the ones that still is steadily increasing over time. And we know that people who work outdoors are at particular risk. And most of the skin cancer prevention work in the world has occurred in Australia, Germany, and the United States, and they've largely focused on recreation-related industries. So you can see here that actually we know that the #1 predictor of how much sun exposure a person gets is, are they an outdoor worker? So that's basically the first question that we'd ask people if we want to determine how much exposure they get to the sun. This slide just shows some general results from a paper that we published as part of CAREX Canada. So you can see here our estimates for the number of outdoor workers in Canada. We estimated that about 1.5 million people were exposed to solar radiation as outdoor workers. This is a huge number of people, and it's about 9% of the working population in Canada. And most of those exposed are men, and this continues to this day where most of the outdoor workers we see in Canada are men. You can also see that most people are in the high category of exposure, and how we define that is people that spend 75% or more out of their work days outside, so generally at least 6 of their working hours out of 8, spending that outside consistently. And you'll know in Canada, I'm sure most callers in are from Canada, it's not as big of a hazard in the winter for most workers. There's some recreation workers working on ski hills, for example, where we might see some higher exposures in the winter, but most of this risk is really confined to the summer months. I'm showing here now some of the results of the Burden of Occupational Cancer project, which was led out of the Occupational Cancer Research Centre in Toronto, and for which I'm a co-investigator, and I did a lot of the work for the sun exposure piece, perhaps not surprisingly. So these results here are particular to skin cancer, showing you where workers worked in terms of industry, and then the burden of non-melanoma skin cancer. So you can see here that we estimated about 6% of non-melanoma skin cancers each year are likely caused by outdoor work. So that's what that little AF is. It actually stands for attributable fraction, but all it means is that about 6% of the total number of non-melanoma skin cancers per year we think are from work. About 28% of those occur in workers who work in agriculture, 23% in construction, and so on. And this adds up to about 4,600 cancers each and every year, and leads to a really significant burden on workers as well as on our healthcare system. A big challenge here in Canada and in the world really is that we don't often actually measure solar ultraviolet radiation in outdoor workers. So this is in pretty stark contrast to something like lead or asbestos, where we might have a sense of the levels of exposure that could be experienced by workers because we monitor for those things to make sure that overexposure isn't occurring. Solar radiation is different because there's no legally mandated exposure limit for solar UV radiation, and at least in part, that's part of the reason. And there isn't a standardized method for sampling. So basically, there's not really a limit in Canada for what you can be exposed to, and we don't have a set way of measuring it, so we just don't really measure it. And before this project and a few similar projects led by myself and some of my colleagues in Canada, in particular Thomas Tenkate at Ryerson University, we actually really didn't know what kinds of levels were being experienced in Canada. So this is a fairly hot and new area of research in Canada, although it has been happening elsewhere in the world for longer. You might assume that in a cold country like Canada, the exposure levels wouldn't be a concern. And as I mentioned before, in the winter, they mostly aren't for most workers. But here I'm showing you two maps. So the one on the left shows the yearly average solar irradiation as experienced on the ground across Canada. And so that's basically how much is available for people to be exposed to. And in that map, I guess you could make the argument that sun exposure isn't too much of a problem, except for in the prairies, where you can see it's a bit orange there. The units here don't matter too much, but they just really relate to how much solar radiation is available. However, when you look at the map on the right, which is the average across 10 years of data for just the month of July, which is the peak month in Canada, you can see that there are really high levels of available UV in the peak summer across much wider swaths of Canada, in fact, most of it, and particularly high intensity in the prairies and in southern BC. So that brings us to why we did part two, the measurement study. So in this part of the study, we wanted to quantify how much of this available solar UV radiation that outdoor workers were exposed to in Alberta in the summer of 2019. So the outdoor workers study in Alberta had two main research questions. First of all, what are the typical full-day UV radiation exposure levels for outdoor workers in Alberta? And secondly, what are the determinants of UV radiation exposure? So the word determinants is a bit of jargon that we use a lot in occupational hygiene. It means a specific type of statistical model, but it basically just means what factors cause higher or lower solar UV radiation exposure. And some of those factors that we tend to consider are environmental factors, something personal to the worker in terms of their risk factor, or something that's quite specific to their job. So the final kind of output of this section of the study is a determinants of exposure model, and so I'll share those results with you today, and I'll walk you through them. This study builds upon a select few studies done in outdoor workers in Canada, and it represents the first time a study has measured solar UV radiation in outdoor workers in Alberta. So the Outdoor Workers Project has two components. So we measured UV radiation with a dosimeter, pictured here, kind of deconstructed so you can see what it looks like on the inside, as well as a questionnaire. So we recruited outdoor workers via trade unions and companies who had outdoor working populations, and we collected data last summer between June and September. So those dosimeters there, workers wore them for about 5 consecutive work days. That varies quite a bit, which I'll show you a little later. Some people just had measurements for 1 day. Some people had up to 20 days, but on average about 5 days. These dosimeters record a measurement once per minute between the hours of 7 a.m. and 5 p.m., which are sort of when there's measurable UV radiation in Alberta. The dosimeters measure UV using a sensor that has a spectral response that matches what's called the erythemal action spectrum for human skin, which just means basically the radiation wavelengths that cause sunburn, and those are basically the main cause of skin cancer. They were either worn on the lapel, on the hard hat, or on a little wristband. Dosimeter data is then converted into UV index measures, which you're probably familiar with because they come in our weather forecast. We do that just by a calibration with a spectrophotometer that's owned by Environment Canada, based in Stony Plain. And then we calculate what's called a standard erythemal dose for each day. I'll talk to a little bit about what that SED means in just a minute. For the questionnaire, the workers completed this standardized questionnaire that we've used in other studies in Canada before, and it includes risk factors for skin cancer, information about people's demographics, and some of their work characteristics. Just a little bit more about these dosimeters, since, as I mentioned before, there isn't really a standardized way of measuring UV, just to sort of say why I like to use these ones. So you can see them, they were developed in New Zealand, they're called the Mark IIs. You can see them sort of in use on people skiing in New Zealand on the left, and then on the right, that's a picture of a calibration that I did a few years ago of some similar dosimeters in Vancouver. So you kind of put them right on top of that Environment Canada station and calibrate them in that way. They're about the diameter of a toonie, and they're less than a centimeter thick. They're wireless, and they're data logging. They can store a lot of data. You can program them so that they only sample during those hours of 7 to 5, so you're not wasting battery power at night. And they measure in that sunburning part of the UV radiation spectrum. A bit more detail on the questionnaires. So we have information about time that they spent outside at work, some of their sun protection habits, including whether they wear sunscreen, clothing to cover up, shade seeking. There are some risk factors for skin cancer that we know about. So people's skin type, so people with paler skin, lighter hair and eye color, and with more freckles are at higher risk. We know risk increases with age. So we had information on people's age as well as their family history. Another great indicator of your skin cancer risk is past exposure, which we measure by childhood sunburns, and then some of the tanning and protective behaviors that people use. We also have information on their current job and their longest job held. So I'm going to try to make this not super complicated, and I've tried to make the results basically more intuitive than these sort of determinants of exposure models, which can be complicated. So just now to touch on, we did these marginal models to allow for repeated measures. So basically in statistical analyses, if you have things that are correlated with each other, so we had a lot of people in our study who got sampled on the same day, which makes their measurements correlated. So we have to actually control for that in our modeling. The models, what we're trying to do is to measure the outcome in standard erythemal dose per day, or SED day. So I know I mentioned before I would talk about what SED means. So these are the units of solar UVR dose that we use kind of as an international standard. So for some context, the internationally recommended exposure limit is measured in SED days. And it's about 1 to 1.3. There's a range due to the variability in people's skin types by country, but it's around 1 if you just keep that in mind. And that basically equates to enough UV radiation for a fair-skinned person to just turn red, so to just get a sunburn. So basically the limit is set in other countries that do adopt it legally to prevent sunburn at work. So the variables that we considered in our model, so we basically put all these different variables in the model and then take them out one by one, based on how important they were in the model, which we determined by statistical significance. So the variables that we put into the model were age, sex, race, skin type, which of course is an indicator of how fair or dark people's skin is, hair and eye color, that measure of having at least one blistering or painful sunburn as a child, the number of sunburns people experienced the previous summer, family history, city, because we did do some sampling kind of all over Alberta, and forecast. So basically weather matters. The sunnier days, we expect to see higher exposure, and then some information about people's job group. So just getting into some results here, just to show you a little bit about the characteristics of our workers. So 12 companies participated in the study. They were located across Alberta, and we actually had a few participants from sites in Saskatchewan and BC who heard about our study and wanted to participate. So we mailed out some dosimeters to them and they participated as well. The job types included trades workers, people doing recreation type work, landscape and maintenance, security, mostly parking security, so people kind of out in parking lots, as well as some professional services workers. So you can see here we recruited almost 200 people, which we were really happy with. Most of our participants were male, which we expect. We know most outdoor workers are male. They're mostly Caucasian here, 75%, and with a mean age of 37, so relatively young, but people in their teen years up to the age of 70. More than half of them had a history of a painful or blistering sunburn as a kid. So this is actually interesting because you might notice too that skin types 1 or 2, those are folks that tend to sunburn a lot. And you can see that only 30% of people reported those skin types. So these are all self-report. So that gives us an indication that people are over-reporting their skin type, meaning they're saying that they are less susceptible than they are. They have darker skin than they actually do, because we know that if they have had blistering sunburns as a child, it's very likely that they actually do have skin type 1 or 2. So that's very commonly found in outdoor working populations. They like to report that they have hardier skin. This slide shows a histogram for the daily SED measurements, of which we had 883 days included. So that's what the frequency is. It looks a lot higher than the number of people because this is the number of days actually recorded in the study. So I'll just recall that an SED of around 1 is generally considered as the international standard for workplace exposure, and it's the amount of radiation that will generally give a fair-skinned person a sunburn. So you can see, you can kind of read this slide in a good way and a bad way. So about half the exposure days in the study were between 0 and 1, so kind of below that international standard that is not technically enforceable in Canada, but we kind of use it to compare or give ourselves a benchmark. But then about half of these were above 1, and some were extremely high, our highest one getting up into the range of 16 SED, which is really, really quite high for Canada. Here I'm showing you the distribution of exposure as compared to that standardized exposure limit. So this is a bit different than the previous slide. So this actually has each worker's mean exposure over their sampling time. So this is looking at number of workers rather than number of days in the sample. So some interesting findings to pick out of this slide. So first of all, most workers' mean exposure was less than the occupational exposure limit, which is great. However, that doesn't mean that they didn't exceed it on any of those individual days. And in fact, from the previous slide, we know that they probably did at least some of the time exceed for a day or so here in their sampling time. Secondly, you can see that a substantial number of workers in 3 of the main trades had workers with high exposure levels in the sort of double to quadruple, even some in 10 times the OEL as their mean exposure. So these workers were the trade workers, the landscapers and maintenance, and the recreational workers. So they really are the people that in our CAREX work we know are spending consistently more than 6 hours a day outside. So these are the workers that are really kind of getting into those more dangerous exposure levels. Now looking at some numbers, and again, I don't want this to be too complicated. I'm going to walk you through it. These are basically the bivariate results of our preliminary model here. So these data here are corrected for those repeated days as well as repeated subjects, since each person had many days. So this is just basically showing you the relationship between each of the variables down the first column on their own and SED. So what is the link between those variables and the SED received? The p-value in the right column will show you which were statistically significant, which occurs here in our study when the p-value is less than 0.05. So just a couple things here I'd like to draw your attention to. First, you can see that the mean dose per day overall was about 2 SED, which is almost double that international standard I mentioned before. So while this isn't enforceable in Canada, as I mentioned as well, it shows that workers in our study were consistently being overexposed. Secondly, you can see some interesting differences in dose between the job groups. So namely that those landscape and maintenance workers had more than triple the dose. So if you look under the job group section, their mean dose was about 2.6 SED compared to some of those security and professional services workers, which were coming in under 1. We also interestingly found that people with light hair had a higher SED dose, which isn't often found. I'm not really sure. It's interesting. It's perhaps a quirk of the population demographics in Alberta. I'm not sure why red-haired people would have higher exposure, but in our study, they did. And the placement of the dosimeter also mattered. This is not surprising. We find this fairly often. So if people put the dosimeter on their hard hat, their levels were actually up around 3.6, whereas if they wore them on the lapel or watch, it was about 1.6. And this makes sense just because if there's a sort of a measurement device on the top of your head, it's going to capture more of that available UV. Finally, you can see at the bottom there that spending more time outdoors also increased the dose experience. And so that number there, 0.2, means that for every additional hour that you spend outside at work, your SED went up by 0.2. Now, this is that final complicated model, which again, I'll walk you through for the determinants of exposure, the determinants of the standard erythemal dose per day. So if we took all those factors on the slide I just presented in a moment ago into account at once, what actually remains as important for predicting those SEDs? So these numbers here are just shown as betas in a model. It's not really important what they are. Just kind of look at the magnitude of them. It is linked to SED. What matters here really is whether or not they're positive or negative. So if the number is positive, it means that that factor increases the dose that you receive. And if it's lower than 1 in negative, then that means it decreases the dose you receive. So I've separated out as well on the left-hand side the more kind of situational factors that remained in our models that influenced exposure levels versus the things that were more specific to the workers on the right side. So you can see here that not surprisingly, the more time that you spend outside, the higher your exposure was, because that's a positive number there with a statistically significant result. You can see also that the cloudy days compared to the sunny days had a lower SED, not surprising at all. But importantly, I really would like to point out here that at least in Alberta, the mixed days were almost no different from the sunny days. So if it's a mixed cloudy day, your exposure is almost the same as on a full bright sunny day. Calgary had the lowest exposure in our group. People had higher exposure levels in Edmonton and other places in our studies. You can also see that placement of their dosimeter did end up mattering in our final model. So people who were putting it on their hard hat, we're seeing them have higher levels. On the worker side, on the right side of this slide, you can see the impact of education actually remained in the model, such that those with less education had higher exposure. This does sometimes come up in studies like this. It often relates to who ends up in management type jobs. So people with management type jobs tend to have lower exposure because they're doing things like paperwork more often, and folks who are more in the entry level jobs might be outside for longer and thus have higher exposures. That hair color piece did remain as almost significant in our model. So it's a little bit above 0.05 on the p-value there. But we did see that people with red and blonde hair did have higher exposures than those with dark blonde and light brown, which is pretty interesting. And also we know these people are at higher risk of skin cancer. So it is of a bit of concern and probably does reflect some of the population demographics of Alberta. Finally, we know that job title was also important. So here we've compared all the other workers to the trades workers. So that's why you see a lot of them are lower, because our trades workers had higher exposures as I showed you in previous slides. So we can see that after controlling for all these other variables in the model, that security workers and those in professional services had lower exposures than people who were in the construction trades, as well as those recreational workers who had even higher exposure than trades, who are mostly construction workers. So I'm getting too close to my section ending here, so I'll just talk a little bit about the strengths and limitations of this phase of our work. So this was the first study ever to objectively characterize the UV radiation exposure in Alberta. Also, I'll note our dosimeters are novel, they're really unique, they're wireless, you can reuse them. We do really find that it raises awareness and builds capacity for the development of prevention programs, and also they very, very infrequently lose data, so that's really great. We only actually lost one dosimeter all summer, which is quite good. Some of the limitations, so this is not likely representative of a normal Alberta summer. For those of you in Alberta, you'll recall that it was a pretty depressing, cloudy and rainy summer last year. And so these levels, even though they are quite high, are probably usually higher in Alberta. So we would like to do some more studies in a more typically sunny summer to see how that impacts our results. This can make it hard to compare to other studies because we've done, used these different dosimeters, but they are becoming more and more popular just because they are reusable and you can look for peak exposures in the day because they're measuring once per minute. So I think this is probably the way that we're going with exposure assessment for UV. So just to conclude this portion of the study, so exposure to UV radiation from the sun is high enough to be of concern in Alberta, even in a quote unquote low exposure summer. And the jobs that we found were at particular high risk of exposure were recreation workers and those who are working in the trades. So now I'm going to pass you over to Nicole, who's going to take us through the results of our monitoring and surveillance piece of the project.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole, and as part of the study team, I was tasked to look into the monitoring component of this project. So I will describe some of the things we discovered about occupational surveillance and how we might move forward with surveillance of non-melanoma skin cancer or sun exposure in Alberta. So what is surveillance? The purpose of surveillance systems for occupational health and safety is to provide the data and analyses needed to understand the relationships between work and injuries and illnesses in order to improve worker safety and health and to prevent work-related injuries and illnesses. So this is a definition used in the National Academies of Scientists report, A Smarter National Surveillance System for Occupational Safety and Health in the 21st Century. Typically, surveillance starts with planning and designing the system, collecting the data, organizing and managing the data, analyzing the data, interpreting the results, and communicating the information to the groups of people who would benefit from it. The final task of a surveillance system is to use the information to guide policy or help to put interventions or prevention programs in motion. In Canada, there is no national or single all-encompassing occupational health and safety surveillance system. Instead, there exist various provincially run surveillance schemes that use an array of surveillance strategies. In Canada, occupational health is a provincial responsibility and there is no national systematic process for surveillance. Work-related disease or occupational disease information, as opposed to injury, has not been included in most occupational health surveillance programs in Canada. Therefore, addressing occupational disease is definitely an area for growth within Canada and also within Alberta. So the main research question here, what are the best practices for creating an sun exposure and skin cancer surveillance system for outdoor workers in Alberta? To answer this question, we undertook a literature review and conducted key informant interviews. I will briefly go over some of the findings from the literature review and then discuss the results of the key informant interviews. The initial goal of the literature review was to determine whether occupational exposure or disease surveillance has been conducted for outdoor workers previously and to identify the key planning components for structuring an effective occupational disease or health surveillance program. It became clear very early on in the review that there is not much literature available that focused specifically on occupational disease or health surveillance systems for outdoor workers. We decided at this point to tweak our literature search to look at surveillance in a more general or broad way. There were two specific aims for the review. The first was to obtain a better understanding of the various types of occupational disease or health surveillance strategies that exist. And the second was to determine whether the described system can be applied to outdoor workers with a primary focus on non-melanoma skin cancer. Based on the literature review, we have prepared a table of surveillance practices as part of our grant deliverables, and it will be available shortly. So this slide describes some of our results. There are 5 types of surveillance strategies outlined here that we identified and which are included in our table of surveillance practices. Please note that this does not include all possible surveillance strategies, but these particular ones were chosen as they may be applicable to a surveillance program for outdoor workers. So one of the first strategies is exposure registry. Exposure registries are designed to collect information about workers exposed to a specific occupational risk or risks and can be used to assist in compensation-related decisions as a reason for disease screening, to carry out exposure surveillance, or to help identify new exposure-disease relationships. An example of an exposure registry in Canada is the WorkSafe BC Exposure Registry. Since 2012, WorkSafe BC implemented an online exposure registry program. Next, we have disease registries. Disease registries are similar to exposure registries, but only include workers who have been diagnosed with a specific disease. Most often, registrations are done on a voluntary basis and by physicians. Because of the voluntary nature of this type of registry, there can be substantial underreporting of the disease, and this is certainly a drawback to this method of surveillance. The UK's occupational skin surveillance, or EPIDERM, is an example of a disease-based registry that has been in place since 1993. Next, we have disease screening or medical surveillance. Disease screening or medical surveillance monitors the occurrence of a specific disease or diseases within a defined population. Typically, disease screening is mandated by a regulatory body. The screening is conducted to determine whether a worker has had excessive exposure to a specific agent and whether there are early signs of work-related disease. An example of a medical surveillance system is the Coal Workers Health Surveillance Program of the U.S. National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health and has been in place since 1969. Sentinel event surveillance. So sentinel surveillance systems in occupational health involve the ongoing and rapid identification of sentinel health events, which are defined as a preventable disease, disability, or untimely death whose occurrence serves as a warning signal. The Norwegian Labour Inspectorate Registry for Work-Related Disease, or RAS for short, is an example of a sentinel surveillance scheme. It was designed with the principle of the sentinel health event in mind. Since 1977, it is mandatory for physicians to report all suspected and confirmed cases of work-related disease to the Norwegian Labour Inspectorate. Finally, we have disease surveillance via data linkage. The key premise of this method is that various data sources are linked to estimate the extent and distribution of occupational disease. Typically, large data sets are used, and they generally include information on a person's occupation or industry of employment. An example of this method is the Occupational Disease Surveillance System, or the ODSS, in Ontario. The ODSS website describes the system as follows. This system was created in 2016 by linking existing provincial health databases with job information in order to study occupational disease and inform prevention activities. The ODSS identifies at-risk groups of workers and potential hazardous exposures within the workplace. The key informant interviews were conducted to better understand the barriers and facilitators to developing and implementing an effective occupational surveillance program, as well as to understand the key considerations in the development of a surveillance system. Interviews were conducted with 22 key informants from Canada, Europe, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States. The participants were principally chosen on the basis of whether they had experience in designing or implementing occupational surveillance systems and/or had expertise in skin cancer prevention or research. So, based on these interviews, the top 5 barriers for designing and implementing a surveillance program included underreporting or underparticipation, funding and competing resources, lack of awareness of risk, mandatory versus voluntary participation, lack of a collection mechanism. So we'll first start here with underreporting and underparticipation. So 13 or 59% of the interviewees mentioned that the underreporting of occupational disease or work-related disease is a challenge. This particular barrier is also mentioned in many of the articles and reports that were included in the literature review. It was noted specifically that occupational diseases are often not reported by physicians due to the long latency of the disease and the difficulty linking the occupational disease to work activities. For many of the occupational diseases, and particularly for cancer, they are considered chronic diseases, and many of them will not surface until a person is retired from work. It is very likely that a physician may not look at work history and link the disease to occupation. So as you see in this one quote here, more than anything else, the biggest problem is making the link between occupation and health. Funding. 11 of the participants mentioned that funding or competing resources are a challenge when designing a surveillance program. Without proper funding, these programs simply cannot exist. It is important that funding sources are available on a consistent basis to maintain this type of work. So one of our informants, basically the quote here, locking in resourcing and locking in for surveillance programs, my own belief is that you need fairly a long-term commitment for these things. They can't be set up as a year-by-year proposition because you just can't deliver a surveillance program. Next, we have mandatory versus voluntary participation. 7 or 32% of the interviewed individuals flagged the lack of awareness of occupational risk, or perhaps a lack of understanding of this risk of solar UVR or occupational risk in general. This points to the fact that employees may not be very well educated about the risks they face at work, and it would be beneficial to ensure that the employees as well as employers are educated on the topic of risk. Better education about occupational risk and how to minimize it would likely lead to employees making the choice to better protect themselves and perhaps be more interested in participating in surveillance programs. Next, we have mandatory versus voluntary participation. 5 or 23% of the interviewees mentioned that it may be beneficial for a program to be mandatory as opposed to voluntary. There are underlying reasons why employees may choose not to participate in a surveillance program, particularly if it is voluntary, and they include fear of job loss, fear of discrimination, it is not convenient, fear it is not confidential, and fear of finding out they are ill. A mandatory system is more likely to create buy-in. One of the quotes here, if you look here, I think that so from what we saw in that review, certainly the registries that were mandatory, if they were mandatory and they were legislated, then people, I think, were more likely to participate. And finally, we have lack of a collection mechanism. 5 or 23% of our participants mentioned the lack of a collection or reporting mechanism for non-melanoma skin cancer as a perceived barrier. In many countries, non-melanoma skin cancer is not registered in their cancer registries. This means that it can be difficult to track incidences of non-melanoma skin cancer. Currently, we have estimations of the number of non-melanoma skin cancer that are related to occupation, but no real numbers. The estimates certainly raise the red flag, and perhaps they will show us we need surveillance programs in place. However, having the real numbers may jolt more prevention activities into action and a realization that there truly is a problem. Another difficulty is collecting information about occupation. So the one quote here, I'll just read it out. I know that one of the things that we talked about, and I don't know how far it's gotten, and it's the idea that if you've got healthcare system data, there's an opportunity to collect information on occupation, but that's rarely ever done. The idea here is that if this could be done up front, it would be easier to link occupation and disease. A few other barriers that were mentioned in the interviews was cost of preventive measures, lack of an occupational exposure limit for solar UVR, non-melanoma skin cancer is not recognized as an occupational disease. We'll move on to the facilitators. We have communication and collaboration, outreach and education, simple reporting process, funding, and strong leadership and team. So we'll begin with communication and collaboration. 14 or 64% of the participants mentioned that it is important to have good communication or collaboration amongst stakeholders when developing an occupational surveillance program. It is critical to have all stakeholders at the table as this facilitates buy into the program. It allows for better understanding of what is going to happen and why the information is being collected. And just a basic quote here, stakeholders need to really be active participants or partners in setting it up and be happy and supportive of what the goals are. Outreach and education. 9 or 41% of our participants mentioned that outreach or education is a key component in a successful occupational surveillance program. This is somewhat related to our previous slide. Having direct contact or communication with employers and workers is deemed very positive. One of our informants basically said it very nicely. I think I find that when I have individual conversations with individual workers and employers, that's often much more meaningful than some big, promotional thing. This facilitates understanding as to why things are being done. Again, this allows for buy-in. One participant mentioned that when they go out on an inspection and it is at an outdoor work site, they take the time to talk to the workers and employers about risks of sun exposure and how they can protect themselves. Simple reporting process. 5 participants identified that having a simple reporting process would be helpful. This would apply only if there is some type of reporting mechanism included in the surveillance system. Physicians, for example, do not want to be burdened with extra work, so simplifying the reporting process would likely allow for more buy-in and will ensure people will use it. Funding, it's a barrier, but it's also a facilitator. Interestingly enough, 5 or 23% of the individuals mentioned that having guaranteed long-term funding is a critical step. And so I have a couple of quotes here that just basically make it clear that funding is critical. And there's really no point trying to design something that's super duper if the resourcing just isn't there. I think funding, it's tough to kind of do a little splash and you can show impact. But if you don't have like a sustainability partner or an ongoing resource, then it's tough. I think that's just the nature of our department and a lot of government programs. It's tough to get your foot in the door and kind of get those year-long 5 to 10 year commitments to say, here's what the impact you could do in 10 years. Lastly, we have strong leadership in teams. 4 of our interviewees felt that they need strong leadership teams in place. So again, I'll just have this one quote here. I mean, getting honestly just like a practical recommendation is to get a really strong team of people who are capable of doing the work and the analyses that needs to be done, like who are properly trained, who have the skills for data linkages, for programming, statistical modeling, epidemiology, and study design. People who really have the right skill set for doing this kind of work and getting those people in place from the beginning so that you don't have to go back and fix things later. I think this is a very practical, but like really key and important lesson that might help other people. Some of the other facilitators mentioned included physician education, legislation, having non-melanoma skin cancer as a reportable disease, having strong scientific evidence, and incentives for doctors to report. So during the interviews, the participants were asked about some key considerations in the development and implementation of a surveillance program. I will summarize them briefly here. So number 1, for a surveillance program, you need to have a clear purpose or goal. You need to be clear what is the question you're trying to answer, what is the problem you're trying to solve, or the problem you're trying to measure. Number 2, you need to have a defined target population. You need to know exactly who you're focusing on. You need stakeholder involvement for buy-in. It's important to work out exactly who needs to sit around the table. Exposure versus disease monitoring. You have to be clear on whether you're focusing on exposure versus disease. You need to assess the resources available. You need to assess available data sources or how to capture data. So really you need to know, are you going to use existing sources or will you start a new process of data capture? A pilot phase is crucial. You need to work out the bugs of the program. There needs to be program evaluation to make sure that what you've designed is working properly. Dissemination of results is a very critical step. You need to share what has been found. It can perpetuate the need for more of this kind of activity in the future. And really, you hope that surveillance programs will develop interventions, prevention, and that they will guide policy. My last slide here. So really, where do we go from here? We have come up with a few recommendations or steps that can move us forward in a positive direction. I would like to mention that these steps are based on how Germany has progressed in their surveillance of non-melanoma skin cancer. Germany, in our opinion, is probably the most advanced with regards to how they have recognized non-melanoma skin cancer as an occupational disease, how they have been able to keep track of the incidences, how they offer medical screening to outdoor workers, and how they have integrated primary prevention strategies and education. They are truly a very good role model. So based on some of the work done in Germany, we proposed some steps that would move us forward to designing and implementing a non-melanoma skin cancer surveillance program. So really, firstly, we need to recognize non-melanoma skin cancer due to solar UVR as an occupational disease. Currently, Germany recognizes actinic keratosis, or multiple sites of actinic keratosis, which is a precancer, as well as squamous cell carcinoma as an occupational disease. They have very strong scientific evidence that backs up the inclusion of those particular skin diseases as an occupational disease. We need to create a notification mechanism. So really, we need to try and find out what are the real numbers. Could we do that via a cancer registry, have non-melanoma skin cancer included in a cancer registry? Or could we be like Germany, where doctors actually report non-melanoma skin cancer incidences due to occupation? We need to continue or improve primary prevention initiatives. We need to educate workers and employers on risk of solar UVR, and hopefully in the future introduce a medical screening component so that this would facilitate very early diagnoses of skin disease. Thank you very much, and I'm going to pass this back to Cheryl to wrap up.
Great, thanks, Nicole. I'll just wrap us up here. We've still got quite a bit of time for questions, which is great. Just to summarize sort of both of those two projects in one. So occupational sun exposure is an important cause of disease in Alberta and in Canada. In the course of our research, we've quantified exposure levels for Alberta, and we've made some recommendations on how to support outdoor workers via a surveillance program. Just as a heads up for those of you who are interested, our exposure paper is almost ready to be submitted. Nicole and I are working on a surveillance paper as well, so those will be our kind of scientific outputs. And we are also really keen to identify new groups for exposure monitoring. So please keep that in mind. If anyone on the line has outdoor workers they'd like to do some sampling with, we still have all those 70 dosimeters and would love to use them again for some more exposure monitoring in the future. I would be remiss if I didn't mention some tools and resources for those of you who are looking for next steps. So I mentioned this project before, Sun Safety at Work Canada, that I was a part of, that was led by Thomas Tenkate at Ryerson University. We did some sampling as part of that study as well, but basically a lot of it was knowledge translation to sort of speak to managers and speak to workers. So I have some of the resources from Sun Safety at Work here. There's also some videos for workers and managers as well. And so I encourage you to visit that website for some practical tips on reducing skin cancer risk in outdoor workers. Just to keep in touch with us on this project or any of our other CAREX Canada projects, there's a number of ways to do that here, including email address, our website, and our Twitter handle. I'd also just like to, again, acknowledge the funding support for this study from Alberta Labour and Immigration's OHS Futures program. And I really appreciate you joining us today and for your interest in these two projects that we've been so excited to do over the last year. And we're very excited to kind of share these more widely. And if you do have any further questions that we didn't get to, or if you have any further ideas for collaborations, absolutely get in touch. We would love to hear from you. So thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.